The first strange thing about the city is not what is broken, but what remains untouched. The stones still rest in their places, the walls still stand where they were raised, and the streets show no scars of fire, invasion, or collapse. The city looks less like a ruin and more like a paused scene, as if time itself stepped away and never returned. Doors are left slightly open, storage jars remain half filled with grain and oil that were never used, and tools still lie where hands last placed them. There are no signs of panic, no shattered walls, no scattered weapons, and no bodies in the streets. Life did not end here in any visible way. It simply withdrew, leaving behind a space that feels suspended between use and abandonment. Archaeologists normally expect to find layers of destruction, rebuilding, or slow decay, each marking a chapter in a city's long story. Here, they find interruption instead of collapse. The layers do not tell a story of gradual change or sudden disaster, but of a moment where ordinary life stopped unfolding. The city does not fully belong to the living world, because no one lives here now, but it does not belong to the world of ruins either, because nothing here has died. It feels unfinished, like a sentence that was never completed, and that unfinished quality is what gives the place its unsettling presence. It is not the age of the stones that creates the mystery, but the absence of an ending. This silence invites attention before it invites explanation. It creates a discomfort that does not push the mind toward quick answers, but toward careful observation. A city is expected to fall loudly through war, famine, or disaster, yet this place does none of those things. It remains intact, orderly, and strangely calm, and that calmness feels heavier than destruction would. The absence of visible cause forces the listener to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it. The city becomes not an archaeological problem to be solved, but a narrative presence to be felt, a reminder that not all endings announce themselves with noise or violence. As one stands within this stillness, the city begins to feel less like a location, and more like a choice that was made long ago. The mind starts to wonder not what destroyed the city, but what persuaded its people to leave something that still worked. That question does not demand an immediate answer, but it quietly opens the door to the next part of the story. If this city did not end in fire or collapse, then it becomes important to understand what kind of city it once was, how it lived, what it valued, and what kind of world it belonged to before it fell silent. To understand why the city's silence feels unnatural, it helps to imagine it before the stillness arrived, when sound and movement were part of its daily rhythm. The streets were not empty paths between stones, but living corridors shaped by footsteps, voices, and routine. Workshops echoed with the soft ringing of bronze being worked into tools and ornaments, and the smell of heated metal mixed with the scent of oil, grain, and wood. Along the edges of the city, traders arrived from distant coasts, carrying goods that had crossed seas and passed through many hands before reaching this place. These objects did not only bring wealth, but connection, binding the city into a network of exchange that stretched far beyond its walls. The city was not a remote outpost or a forgotten settlement at the edge of civilization. It was woven into a wider world through sea routes, shared customs, and common beliefs that gave structure to everyday life. Its buildings were not placed randomly, but arranged with care, showing a sense of order and intention. Storage rooms were filled with provisions for seasons yet to come, suggesting planning rather than desperation. Religious spaces were maintained not as empty symbols but as active centers of meaning, where rituals marked time, change, and continuity. Families gathered at dusk, not in fear but in familiarity, moving through patterns that had been repeated long enough to feel permanent. Nothing in this picture suggests a city in decline. There is no sign of decay in its organization, no evidence that it was losing its purpose or its place in the world. On the contrary, the city shows every sign of expecting to continue. Its people invested in it as if tomorrow mattered, as if the future was not only assumed but prepared for. Tools were made to last, buildings were repaired rather than abandoned, and supplies were stored for use rather than survival. This was not a city waiting to die. It was a city planning to live. That is what makes its disappearance so unsettling. The city does not feel like something that reached a natural ending, but like something that was interrupted mid-motion. It is as if a sentence was stopped halfway through, not because the meaning had ended, but because the speaker had suddenly gone quiet. The structures, the objects, and the layout all point toward continuity, And that continuity was never completed. The city was not fading into irrelevance or collapsing under its own weight. It was functioning, connected, and purposeful. And that makes its silence feel less like a consequence and more like a decision or an event that did not leave a physical trace. By rebuilding the city in this way, the mystery becomes sharper rather than softer. When a place that is already failing disappears, the explanation feels close at hand. But when a place that is working, growing, and integrated into its world vanishes, the absence becomes harder to explain. The listener begins to feel not just curiosity, but a sense of loss for something that was not finished, for a story that was not allowed to reach its next chapter. The city's silence is no longer just strange, it becomes meaningful, and that meaning deepens the question rather than resolves it. What kind of force, idea, or change could be powerful enough to pull people away from a future they were clearly preparing for, and to persuade a living city to abandon its own continuation? When people imagine the end of an ancient city, they usually imagine force. They imagine armies arriving at the gates, fires spreading through streets, walls collapsing, and lives ending in violence. History itself has trained us to expect this kind of ending, because it leaves behind clear evidence. Burned layers seal moments in time, broken weapons tell stories of conflict, and mass graves mark sudden death. Destruction leaves marks that survive long after memory fades, and so it becomes the easiest explanation to reach for when a city stands empty. It feels intuitive, dramatic, and familiar, and for that reason, it is often the first answer we offer to silence. Archaeologists know this expectation well, and they know what to look for when violence has passed through a place. They search for layers of ash and charcoal, for walls blackened by fire, for collapsed structures that were never rebuilt. They look for hurried burials or bodies left where they fell, for weapons scattered across streets, for signs that people fled in panic or fought in desperation. They also look for absence itself, for valuables that have been taken, for sacred objects that have been stolen, for evidence that a conquering force stripped the city of its wealth before moving on. All of these signs together form the signature of war, and when war has happened, it almost always leaves something behind. In this city, those signs do not appear. The stones are not burned, the walls are not shattered, the streets are not layered with ash or filled with debris from collapsed roofs. There are no broken weapons, no defensive structures hastily repaired, and no graves that suggest sudden mass death. Even objects that would have been valuable in any ancient economy remain where they were left, untouched and uncollected. Storage jars still hold their contents, tools still lie in workshops. Decorative items remain in homes and religious spaces. Nothing suggests looting, and nothing suggests conquest. This absence is not subtle, it is complete. If an army had come, the city would show fear in its physical form. Buildings would be damaged, and the ground would hold the scars of violence. If the city had been conquered, it would show signs of occupation or stripping, a rearrangement of space that reflected new control. If it had been destroyed, it would show collapse, fire, and burial beneath its own ruins. But none of these patterns appear here. The city remains orderly, intact, and strangely calm, as if no hostile presence ever crossed its threshold. What makes this more unsettling is not simply that destruction is missing, but that its absence refuses to be explained away. It is not that the evidence has eroded or been lost to time, because other sites of the same age still preserve clear traces of violence. It is not that the city was too small or insignificant to attract conflict, because it shows every sign of being integrated into a wider world of trade and connection. The silence is not the result of disappearance through decay. It is the result of something that did not happen. As this realization settles, the idea of war slowly loses its grip on the story. It does not collapse suddenly or dramatically. It fades, the way a thought fades when it no longer fits the facts that surround it. The explanation does not feel wrong in theory, but it feels wrong here, in this place, among these stones. The mind stops insisting on destruction not because it has been disproven, but because it no longer belongs. The city becomes harder to place within familiar narratives. It does not fit the story of conquest or collapse that has shaped much of ancient history. It resists being turned into a lesson about power, invasion, or defeat. Instead, it remains something quieter and more difficult to name, a reminder that not all endings come from conflict, and not all disappearances are forced. By the time the idea of violence has fully faded, it leaves behind not relief, but a deeper unease. If the city was not emptied by war, then its silence becomes more mysterious, not less. The obvious answer has been removed, and what remains is a space where other explanations must wait their turn. The listener is no longer watching a familiar story unfold, but standing at the edge of an unknown one, where certainty has been gently taken away and replaced with attention. And once violence is no longer the cause, the mind naturally begins to look elsewhere. If no enemy crossed these streets, then perhaps something less visible, less intentional, and less human played a role. If the city was not emptied by force, then perhaps it was shaped by something that does not leave weapons or ruins behind. The story turns, quietly and without announcement, toward the possibility that the cause of the silence was not an act of aggression, but an act of nature, or time, or change that moves without anger and without sound. Once violence has been set aside, the mind turns naturally toward nature, because nature is the other great force known for reshaping human life. Earthquakes split stone and shift foundations. Floods carry silt into streets and leave waterlines along walls. Volcanic eruptions coat cities in ash and seal them into time. Droughts wither crops and empty storage rooms. Plagues leave behind sudden death and hurried burial. Each of these events has a recognizable fingerprint, a pattern that remains long after the event itself has passed. These patterns become the language through which archaeologists read disaster, and they are usually clear enough to speak across thousands of years. In this city, those signatures are missing. The foundations are not cracked or shifted. The buildings have not collapsed inward. The ground does not hold layers of silt or mud that suggest flooding, and the walls are not coated with ash or residue from volcanic fallout. Roofs have not fallen suddenly, and streets are not buried beneath debris that would mark a violent natural event. There is no evidence of sudden mass death, no graves hastily dug, no skeletons left behind where people fell. The physical record does not speak of catastrophe. It speaks of continuity that was simply paused. Even when the focus turns to slower forms of stress, the evidence remains quiet. If drought had pushed the people away, the city would show signs of desperation in its final phase. Empty storage rooms, malnutrition, or a gradual thinning of population. If water had vanished, wells would show signs of overuse or abandonment in stages. If disease had spread, there would be traces of mortality, disruption, or emergency behavior in how the city was left behind. But none of these appear. The storage rooms were not empty, the tools were not discarded in haste, the homes were not stripped or altered in response to crisis. The city does not look like a place under pressure. It looks like a place that was functioning normally until it was not. What becomes unsettling is not that no disaster occurred, but that the city shows no sign of preparing for one either. There is no evidence of fortification, no signs of rationing, no attempts to adapt or rebuild. The people did not seem to be responding to danger. They did not appear to be struggling against their environment. They were not reacting to visible collapse. They were simply gone. This shifts the story into a quieter, more ambiguous space. If neither war nor nature forced the city to empty, then the disappearance begins to feel less like a reaction and more like a choice. The city did not flee a burning world. It seems to have stepped away from a world that still looked intact. It did not escape a visible threat. It moved before a threat became visible at all. This idea is more difficult to sit with than disaster or violence, because it suggests that not all endings come from impact. Some come from perception. Some come from anticipation. Some come from changes that happen inside people rather than outside their walls. By the end of this process of elimination, the listener is left not with a cause, but with a feeling. A feeling that whatever moved this city did not leave marks in stone or soil. It left marks in decisions, in belief, in a shared sense that something had shifted in a way that could not be measured or recorded. Nothing broke this city. Nothing buried it. Nothing poisoned it. And yet it is empty. With both human and natural explanations fading into silence, the story now moves toward forces that do not leave fingerprints in the ground. Forces that act not on buildings but on minds, not on walls but on meaning. The next step is no longer to search for impact, but to search for motive, for belief, for fear, and for the invisible currents that can move entire societies without leaving a physical trace behind. Once physical danger has been set aside, the story moves inward, away from the ground and into the human mind, because not all collapses happen in stone and soil. Some collapses happen in meaning. They happen when the way people understand their world changes faster than the world itself. A city can survive earthquakes, wars, and famine, but it cannot survive the loss of confidence in its own reality. When belief shifts, behavior follows. And when behavior shifts collectively, entire societies can move without a single wall being touched. History offers many quiet examples of this kind of movement. Communities have abandoned fertile land because of a prophecy that predicted disaster. Towns have emptied because of rumors of unseen disease that never fully arrived. Pilgrimages have turned into permanent migrations when people became convinced that sacred ground had shifted elsewhere. None of these movements were driven by visible force. They were driven by shared interpretation, by a story that people accepted as true enough to act upon. The physical world remained stable, but the psychological world did not, and it was the psychological world that decided where people lived. This is where the city begins to look different. It no longer appears as a place fleeing destruction, but as a place fleeing a change in meaning. Something in the story its people told themselves about their world may have stopped working. Perhaps an omen was seen in the sky and interpreted as a warning. Perhaps a ritual failed and was taken as a sign of withdrawal or disfavor. Perhaps a series of small, ordinary disruptions were woven together into a larger narrative of impending collapse. None of these possibilities need to be true in a material sense to be effective. They only need to be believed. Belief is not a weak force. It is one of the strongest forces human beings possess, because it shapes what people consider safe, sacred, or worth protecting. When belief shifts, priorities shift with it. A place that once felt stable can suddenly feel wrong. A future that once felt secure can suddenly feel closed. In such moments, leaving does not feel like loss. It feels like alignment, like moving toward a version of the world that still makes sense. The city, seen through this lens, becomes less a victim of events and more a participant in interpretation. Its people may not have been running from danger, but from a story that no longer fit. The ground beneath their feet did not crack, but the meaning they assigned to it may have. Their decision to leave would then not be an act of panic, but an act of coherence, an attempt to live in a world that still felt ordered. This kind of movement rarely leaves evidence, because evidence belongs to matter, not to thought. Beliefs do not fossilize. Fears do not leave layers in the soil. They pass through communities, shape decisions, and vanish, leaving only the results behind. A city that empties because of belief looks the same as a city that empties because of nothing at all. By the end of this reflection, the listener is invited to sit with a subtle but unsettling idea. A city does not need to be attacked to be abandoned. It only needs to believe it should leave. And belief, once shared, can be more powerful than any army or earthquake. This realization shifts the mystery again, away from events and towards systems of meaning. If the cause of the silence was not physical, then it must be cultural, spiritual, or psychological. The story now turns toward the frameworks through which people understood their world, because if belief moved this city, then the structure of that belief becomes the next place where answers might be found. For the people of the ancient world, reality was not divided into separate layers of physical and spiritual life. The world was a single fabric, woven from visible actions and invisible meaning. Crops did not grow only because of rain and soil. They grew because the gods allowed them to grow. Ships did not reach their destinations only because of skill and wind. They arrived because the divine order permitted safe passage. Every part of life rested on the assumption that unseen forces were watching, guiding, approving, or warning. Stability was not just built in stone. It was built in favor. Within this framework, religion was not a set of beliefs added to life. It was the structure that made life understandable. Rituals marked time, defined success and failure, and created a sense of continuity between generations. Temples were not distant symbols, but active centers of meaning, where the relationship between humans and the unseen was maintained. Priests were not only spiritual figures, but interpreters of reality itself. Through them, signs were read, seasons were understood, and the future was made legible. If that system faltered, everything else became uncertain. A failed ritual was not a simple mistake. It was a message. A strange event in the sky was not only a natural occurrence, it was a sign. An illness among sacred figures was not just misfortune. It was a warning. When meaning is organized this way, silence is not neutral. Silence is absence. Silence is withdrawal. The city's stillness begins to resemble this kind of withdrawal. Just as the gods may have been perceived as stepping back from the world, the people of the city stepped back from the place they had lived in. The physical silence of the city mirrors the spiritual silence they may have felt. The unanswered prayer becomes the unanswered future. When the gods stop responding, the world stops making sense. And when the world stops making sense, staying becomes harder than leaving. This is not superstition, it is structure. Religion in this context was not about belief in the modern sense. It was a shared language through which reality itself was interpreted. It told people what mattered, what was dangerous, what was safe, and what was worth preserving. When that language failed, it did not leave behind a small gap. It left behind a vacuum that people cannot live inside. The city may not have been abandoned because it was unsafe, but because it no longer felt aligned with the order of the world. The people may have felt that the ground beneath them had not changed, but the meaning of that ground had. In such a moment, leaving is not escape, it is restoration. It is the attempt to find a place where the world still speaks clearly. This makes the disappearance feel less like loss and more like transition. The city was not rejected, it was released. The people did not flee their home. They followed their understanding of the world as it shifted somewhere else. By the end of this reflection, the city's silence no longer feels empty. It feels intentional, shaped by a deep structure of meaning that once guided every aspect of life. The stones are quiet because the story that animated them moved on. What happens when the gods stop answering is not chaos. It is movement. And yet belief alone rarely acts in isolation. For a fear to spread across an entire population, for a shift in meaning to become a shift in geography, something usually reinforces it. Something in the wider world echoes the inner change and makes it feel necessary rather than optional. The story now turns outward again, toward the world beyond the city's walls, to ask what external signals might have confirmed this inner sense of withdrawal and transformed a spiritual unease into a collective decision to leave. To understand the city's silence, it is necessary to step beyond its walls and into the world that surrounded it, because no city exists alone. The late Bronze Age world was a network, a web of routes, agreements, shared resources, and mutual dependence that stretched across seas and continents. Tin from distant mountains travelled to coastal ports, copper moved through islands and harbours, grain flowed from fertile plains into crowded centres of power, and luxury goods passed from hand to hand as symbols of status and stability. On the surface, this world looked strong. Palaces still stood, kings still ruled, ships still sailed. But beneath that appearance of order, something was beginning to loosen. Trade routes that had once been reliable became uncertain. Ships arrived late, or not at all. Essential materials grew harder to obtain. Settlements along the coasts were quietly abandoned, not in fire, but in stages, as people drifted away from places that no longer felt secure. In distant lands, palaces that had stood for generations began to burn, and messages between rulers shifted in tone from confidence to urgency. What had once been a stable conversation between powers became a series of warnings, requests, and appeals for help. The language of the world was changing, even if its structure still stood. Collapse in this period did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It spread like a condition. Like cracks moving through ice, it travelled invisibly through systems before breaking through the surface. A disruption in one region weakened another. A shortage in one resource strained many relationships. A single failure echoed outward, not as destruction, but as unreliability. The world became less predictable, and when predictability disappears, trust soon follows. Within such a web, no city could remain untouched. Even a place that looked stable from within would feel the strain through delayed trade, uncertain alliances, and the growing sense that the world beyond its walls was becoming less dependable. The city's silence begins to look less like an isolated mystery and more like an early signal, a quiet response to a world that was slowly losing its coherence. This reframes the city's disappearance not as an overreaction to a local problem, but as a response to a global one. The danger it sensed may not have been present in its own streets, but in the shifting patterns of the wider world. The future was becoming harder to read, harder to trust, and harder to plan for. Stability was no longer something that could be assumed. It had to be chosen, protected, or pursued elsewhere. Seen this way, the city becomes not a victim of collapse, but an observer of it. It listened to signals that had not yet become disasters. It responded to instability before instability reached it directly. The world was beginning to fail quietly, and the city listened to that failure in advance. The city may have been quiet, but the world was screaming. This larger perspective gives scale to the mystery. It lifts it out of the narrow frame of one place and sets it inside the slow unraveling of an entire age. The silence of one city becomes part of a chorus of small withdrawals, subtle shifts, and quiet endings that together marked the beginning of a profound transformation. And if the world was becoming unstable in ways that were not yet visible as destruction, then the next question becomes how that instability was experienced by ordinary people, how it entered daily life, changed habits, altered expectations, and slowly reshaped the sense of what was safe, what was possible, and what was worth holding on to. Large changes in civilization rarely feel large while they are happening. They arrive not as thunder, but as weather, not as a single storm, but as a slow change in the air. For the people of the city, the unraveling of the world would not have announced itself with collapse, but with small disruptions that accumulated quietly. A trader who arrived later than expected, a shipment that never came, a familiar route that suddenly felt unsafe. Each change alone was manageable. Together, they began to reshape how the future felt. Metal, once common enough to build tools and weapons, became harder to obtain. Repairs took longer. Old tools were kept longer than planned. Trade goods that once arrived from distant lands grew rare or expensive. The world became less generous, not through disaster, but through delay. News traveled more often than goods, and that news grew darker with time. Stories of unrest, burned palaces, and abandoned settlements passed from mouth to mouth, not as warnings, but as atmosphere, shaping how people imagined what lay beyond their horizon. Refugees did not always arrive in crowds. Sometimes they came as individuals or families, carrying stories instead of possessions. They spoke of places that no longer felt safe, of lands that had changed, of futures that no longer made sense. These stories did not need to be frightening to be powerful. They only needed to suggest that the world was becoming less reliable than it had been before. This is how uncertainty spreads. Not through panic, but through erosion. The future begins to feel thinner. Plans feel less solid. Promises feel less permanent. What once felt stable begins to feel conditional. People do not flee when danger is visible, because visible danger can be faced, resisted, or survived. People flee when the future itself becomes unreadable, when tomorrow no longer feels like a continuation of today, but like a question with no answer. Staying becomes a risk, and leaving begins to feel like the safer choice. The city's silence starts to look like this kind of choice, not a reaction to something that happened, but a response to something that was unfolding. The people may not have seen collapse, but they may have sensed it, not in the ground, but in the pattern of change around them. They may have recognized that the system they lived inside was no longer stable enough to trust, even if it had not yet failed in a visible way. This reframes abandonment as foresight rather than fear. The city did not run from a burning world. It stepped away from a world that was losing its shape. The people did not flee disaster. They moved before disaster became the only option. Seen this way, the silence becomes a warning rather than a wound. It becomes the trace of a civilization listening carefully to signals that others ignored. It becomes evidence that collapse is not always loud, and that survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes survival is quiet, subtle, and easily mistaken for disappearance. Sometimes the end does not arrive as a disaster. It arrives as a doubt. And once that doubt takes hold, the story no longer centers on what caused the city to leave, but on what that leaving changed. The mystery shifts from cause to consequence, from what moved the city to what the city's movement meant for the world it left behind, and for the people who carried its story into new places. It is easy to think of abandonment as failure, as something that happens when a place can no longer be held. But there is another way to understand it, one that shifts the meaning of the city's silence from loss to intention. What if the people did not leave because they were forced to, but because they chose to? What if they recognized the signs of instability early and acted while they still had the freedom to do so? History offers quiet examples of this kind of movement. Communities have left floodplains before rivers changed course. Coastal towns have retreated inland when seas began to behave unpredictably. Populations have moved away from regions where political alliances became fragile long before war arrived. In each case, the decision to leave was not driven by panic, but by perception. People sensed that the systems they depended on were becoming unreliable, and they chose to step out of those systems before they collapsed around them. The city begins to resemble such a case. Its people may have noticed disruptions in trade, growing tension between distant powers, signs of spiritual unease, or changes in the environment that did not yet amount to disaster, but suggested that stability was no longer guaranteed. None of these signs alone would demand flight, but together they could form a pattern that felt unsafe to ignore. The city did not wait for the fire to arrive. It left before the fire became inevitable. This reframes the silence as deliberate rather than passive. The city was not abandoned because it failed. It was left because its people no longer trusted the future it offered. The decision to go would then not be an act of surrender, but of foresight, a way of preserving life, culture, and continuity by carrying them forward rather than watching them burn in place. Seen this way, the city does not fall behind history. It steps out of it. It exits a story that is about to turn violent and chooses a quieter path that does not leave monuments or ruins behind. It becomes invisible not because it is destroyed, but because it survives in a way that history is not good at recording. This interpretation transforms the mystery itself. The question is no longer what happened to them, but what they saw. What signals reached them before they reached others? What pattern did they notice forming while it was still subtle enough to avoid? What future did they glimpse that made leaving feel wiser than staying? Perhaps the city was not abandoned. Perhaps it escaped. This idea is both unsettling and empowering. It suggests that people are not only shaped by history, but sometimes step outside its most destructive paths. It suggests that silence can be a form of action, and absence can be a form of choice. And if the city chose to leave, then the mystery does not end with empty streets and quiet walls. It moves outward with the people themselves. The next question is not why the city is silent, but where its voice went, where its people carried their knowledge, their customs, and their stories when they stepped away from the place they once called home. When a city is destroyed, its story is usually preserved by the very force that ends it. Burned layers, broken walls, and mass graves become permanent markers that demand explanation. But when a city empties quietly, it leaves almost nothing behind to insist on being remembered. Its people do not become ruins, they become travelers. They carry their lives with them, not in monuments, but in habits, skills, stories, and memory, and those things are far easier for history to lose. The trail that remains is subtle. It does not announce itself in a single place, but in small shifts across many places. Pottery styles change in distant regions, blending old forms with new ones. Architectural details appear where they had not existed before. Words shift in language, and names soften, transform, or disappear entirely. Myths emerge that echo older stories, now told with new characters and new settings. None of this proves migration in a dramatic way, but together it suggests movement, not of armies, but of families, craftsmen, traders, and priests who carried fragments of their former lives into new communities. Over time, the identity of the city dissolves, not because its people are gone, but because they no longer belong to a single place. They become part of other stories. They are absorbed into new cultures, new alliances, and new landscapes. What was once a city becomes a pattern distributed across many locations, too thin to be seen as a single line, too quiet to be preserved as a single name. This is why history so often remembers empires and forgets migrations. Empires leave boundaries, laws, and ruins. Migrants leave children, customs, and traces that blend into their surroundings. When people move quietly, they do not leave evidence that demands attention. They leave evidence that becomes ordinary. Seen this way, the city did not vanish. It scattered. Its people did not die. They became someone else. This realization carries a strange kind of comfort. It suggests that disappearance is not always loss, and that silence is not always emptiness. The city's absence from the record may not reflect what happened to its people, but what kind of ending they chose. They did not fall into history, they passed through it. And yet the city itself remains behind, still silent, still waiting, still asking its quiet question. Even if its people survived elsewhere, the empty place they left continues to exist as a reminder of a choice that cannot be fully traced or confirmed. The stones remain where the voices once were, and the story does not end with survival alone. It ends with a space. A space that asks not what happened to the people, but what it means for a place to outlive its purpose, and what kind of silence remains when life has moved on. There is a way of looking at ruins that treats them as endings, as the remains of something that failed and never recovered. But there is another way to see them, one that is quieter and more unsettling. Ruins can also be communications. They can be traces not of destruction, but of decision. When a city empties without being broken, what remains is not simply debris, it is an imprint left by a choice. The absence of damage becomes a form of evidence. Walls that still stand, streets that are still walkable, and objects that remain where they were last used, all point not to violence, but to intention. The city does not tell us what happened through scars, it tells us through their absence. It speaks in negative space, in what is not there rather than what is. This kind of message is easy to miss, because it does not demand attention, it does not shock, it does not announce itself with drama. It waits. It sits quietly in the ground, holding a shape that only becomes meaningful when someone notices that the usual signs are missing. Seen this way, the city is not a failure. It is a signal. It is a signal that speaks about fragility, not in the sense that life is easily destroyed, but in the sense that life is easily moved. It reminds us that civilizations are not as solid as they appear, and that their most important structures are not their walls or their palaces, but the agreements, beliefs, and expectations that hold people in place. When those invisible structures weaken, physical structures become irrelevant. The city's silence becomes a message about foresight. It suggests that collapse does not always arrive as a surprise. Sometimes it announces itself quietly, through subtle changes in trust, meaning, and continuity. Those who listen early may leave no ruins at all. Those who leave later leave fire behind. The city stands as a reminder of a third path, one where survival is quiet enough to look like disappearance. This is why the past begins to feel uncomfortable here. The city is not only speaking about itself, it is speaking about patterns that repeat. It is reminding us that systems can look stable while they are becoming unreliable, that surface order can hide deeper strain, and that people often sense change before they can name it. The city becomes less an object of study and more a mirror. It reflects the way humans respond to uncertainty, the way they leave when staying no longer feels meaningful, and the way those departures rarely leave records. It tells us that the most important moments in history are often the ones that leave the least evidence behind. Some ruins are not memories, they are messages. They are reminders that not every ending is violent, that not every survival is visible, and that the quietest choices can have the longest shadows. If the city is a message, then the question is no longer why it is empty, but what it is trying to say. What does it mean to leave before destruction arrives? What does it mean to choose silence over struggle, movement over monument, adaptation over resistance? These are not questions the city answers directly, they are questions it leaves behind. And that is perhaps the most powerful thing it does. It does not close the story, it opens it. When the city is no longer treated as a mystery to be solved, but as a story to be listened to, its silence begins to change its meaning. It stops feeling like a gap in knowledge and starts feeling like a form of expression. The empty streets and intact walls no longer ask what happened here, but what kind of response this was. The city becomes a reflection of how human societies behave when the future stops feeling reliable and the present stops feeling secure. History is often written around events, around moments of impact that leave marks in the ground and in memory. But those events are not the only parts of history that matter. Between them are choices, perceptions, and quiet decisions that shape the course of lives without ever becoming visible. The city reminds us that the most important part of any historical moment is not what happened, but how people responded to what they believed was happening. The people of the city did not respond with resistance or spectacle. They did not build monuments to their endurance or leave behind stories of heroic collapse. They did not wait for destruction to justify their movement. They chose something quieter. They chose to leave without burning their home behind them, without marking their departure with drama or finality. They chose invisibility over destruction. This choice does not make the city weak. It makes it precise. It shows a form of intelligence that does not seek to dominate history, but to survive it. It suggests that adaptation is not always loud, and that wisdom does not always announce itself. Sometimes wisdom looks like disappearance. The city becomes a mirror because it reflects something that still exists in the human condition. People continue to live inside systems that feel stable until they do not. They continue to sense change before they can describe it. They continue to face moments when the future becomes unclear and the old patterns stop working. In those moments, the city's story repeats itself in new forms. The lesson is not that people should leave, or that systems will always fail. The lesson is that uncertainty is not an exception in human life. It is a constant. What changes is how people meet it. The city met uncertainty with movement rather than collapse, with foresight rather than fear, with quiet change rather than violent ending. It chose a path that left no record, no monument, and no clear explanation. It chose a path that history is not designed to preserve. And yet that choice remains, preserved in silence. The city did not fail. It made a choice. That choice is what remains. The story does not end with stones in the ground or with questions in the mind. It continues wherever people notice that the future feels different from the past, wherever they sense that continuity is no longer guaranteed, wherever they face the same quiet question the city once faced. Do we stay and wait for certainty to return, or do we move before certainty disappears completely? The city offers no answer. It offers only a reflection. And that reflection is enough, because it reminds us that history is not only something that happens to people. It is something people shape, often quietly, often invisibly, often in ways that only become meaningful long after the choice has been made. The silence is not empty. It is full of meaning. Once the city is no longer seen as an exception, it begins to look like a clue. Its silence stops feeling unique and starts feeling familiar, as if it belongs to a pattern that has been quietly repeating across time and geography. When archaeologists widen their view beyond this single place, they begin to notice other settlements that ended in a similar way. Not in fire, not in conquest, not in disaster, but in absence. Structures remain intact. Objects are left behind. Daily life appears to have paused rather than collapsed. These places do not announce their endings, they whisper them. Across the Mediterranean and the Near East, there are towns and cities that share this strange stillness. Homes are found with unfinished tasks still visible, tools resting where hands last used them, and storage rooms holding supplies that were never consumed. Walls remain standing, streets remain passable. There are no mass graves, no burn layers, no signs of violent disruption. These places look as if their people simply stepped away and never returned. Each case on its own is easy to dismiss as an anomaly, a local curiosity, a site with missing evidence. But when they are seen together, a different picture begins to form. These are not random accidents. They are variations of the same response. They appear most often in periods when larger systems are under strain, when trade becomes unreliable, when political structures weaken, when environmental patterns grow unpredictable, and when belief systems begin to shift. This suggests that abandonment itself can be a strategy, not a failure, but a form of adaptation. When the systems that support a city become fragile, people do not always wait for collapse. Some choose to move, while movement is still possible. They do not resist the change, they flow with it. In this light, loud collapse and quiet disappearance become two different responses to the same condition. Some societies fight to preserve what is breaking and leave behind ruins as a result. Others step away before the break occurs and leave behind silence. Both are human, both are understandable. Only one is easy for history to see. The city becomes one note in a larger melody, a soft pattern that runs beneath the louder stories of empires and wars. It is part of a tradition of quiet endings that are rarely recognized because they do not look like endings at all. They look like emptiness. They look like nothing happened. But something did happen. A choice was made. A movement occurred. A future was avoided. The city was not alone. It was part of something quiet and widespread. This realization changes the emotional shape of the mystery. It is no longer about a single lost place, but about a recurring human behavior that has gone largely unnoticed. It suggests that the story of civilization is not only written in destruction, but also in retreat, not only in collapse, but in quiet transitions that leave little behind. If this pattern exists, if it repeats whenever systems strain and futures grow uncertain, then the question is no longer whether it happened here, but why it is so rarely remembered. Why does history preserve the stories of fire and forget the stories of footsteps? Why do we remember what breaks and lose what moves on? The mystery now shifts from the city to the record itself, from the event to the way events are remembered, and from the past to the way the past is shaped by what survives it. History is shaped less by what happened than by what remained. It is built from traces, from marks left behind that survive long enough to be found, studied, and interpreted. Fires leave ash. Wars leave ruins. Empires leave walls, roads, coins, and inscriptions. These are the materials that time preserves and that historians later transform into narratives. Quiet endings, by contrast, leave almost nothing. When people move without destroying their homes, when they leave before collapse rather than after it, they do not leave evidence that demands attention. They leave spaces. Time does not preserve spaces well. Silence is easily erased. Wind fills it with dust. Rain softens its edges. Plants grow where streets once were. The shape of absence dissolves, and without a clear mark to anchor memory, the story fades. What remains is not a record of departure, but the illusion that nothing happened at all. This is why destruction dominates historical memory. It is not because it is more important, but because it is more visible. It is easier to find a burned city than a quietly emptied one. It is easier to tell a story about violence than about movement. It is easier to remember what breaks than what flows onward. The result is a distorted picture of the past. History becomes a collection of catastrophes and conquests, while the more common human behaviors remain invisible. Adaptation, migration, quiet withdrawal, and subtle change rarely appear in textbooks because they do not leave behind monuments. They leave behind people. The city's story challenges this bias. It suggests that what we call important history may not be the most representative history. The most common response to instability may not be resistance or collapse, but relocation. Not fighting for a place that no longer works, but finding a place that does. In this sense, the true history of humanity may be written not in ruins, but in paths. Not in stones stacked into walls, but in footsteps that move across landscapes and vanish. The most transformative decisions may be the ones that leave the least evidence. History remembers the fire. It forgets the footsteps. This is not a failure of memory. It is a limitation of method. We can only study what remains, and what remains is not always what mattered most to those who lived it. This realization turns the city's silence into a critique of the way we tell stories about the past. It suggests that our picture of collapse is incomplete, that we see only one kind of ending and mistake it for the whole truth. It suggests that we may be living inside the same pattern now, responding quietly to changes that will one day look like nothing happened at all. If history forgets quiet endings, then perhaps we are repeating them without noticing. Perhaps people are already moving in subtle ways, changing their lives, their communities, and their assumptions without spectacle. Perhaps the most important shifts are happening not in headlines, but in habits. The story of the city becomes not just a story about the past, but a lens through which the present can be seen more clearly. And that may be the most powerful thing it offers. Not answers, but awareness. At a certain point, the story of the city stops feeling like something that happened long ago and begins to feel like something that is happening again. Not in the same form, and not with the same details, but with the same emotional shape. The sense of quiet change. The feeling that something familiar is slowly becoming unreliable. The awareness that the world is shifting in ways that are difficult to name. All of this feels as present now as it once did then. Modern life is built on systems that are meant to be stable, on flows of energy, food, information, and trust that connect distant places into a single working whole. Most of the time, these systems are invisible, because they function well enough not to be noticed. But when they begin to falter, even slightly, they become suddenly visible. Delays appear where there were none before. Shortages arise in places that once felt secure. Patterns that were once predictable become irregular. None of this looks like collapse. It looks like discomfort. It looks like doubt. This is how uncertainty enters the present, just as it entered the past. Not as an event, but as a change in feeling. People sense that the future is becoming harder to plan for, harder to trust, harder to imagine clearly. Plans feel more provisional. Promises feel less permanent. The idea of continuity becomes something that has to be maintained rather than assumed. This does not produce panic. It produces vigilance. It produces a low, persistent awareness that the ground is not as solid as it once seemed. This is the same awareness the city may have felt. The people of the ancient world did not have our language for systems or infrastructure, but they had their own ways of noticing when order was thinning. They felt it in the movement of goods, in the reliability of seasons, in the tone of distant messages, and in the confidence of their leaders and priests. We feel it in different forms, but we feel it all the same. The city becomes a mirror, not because the situations are identical, but because the human response is. The past begins to look less like a distant place, and more like a rehearsal for a pattern that repeats whenever complexity grows fragile. This creates not fear, but recognition. A recognition that uncertainty is not a sign that something has gone wrong, but a sign that something is changing. The city did not wait for collapse to acknowledge that change. It responded to the feeling of it. It moved when the future became unclear, not when it became impossible. They felt it before they saw it. So do we. This does not mean that history is repeating itself in a simple way. It means that human perception follows certain rhythms. We notice subtle shifts long before they become undeniable. We adjust our lives quietly before we are forced to adjust them loudly. We make small changes in response to feelings we cannot yet justify with facts. The story stops being about the city and starts being about us, because the city shows us something about how humans live inside uncertainty. It shows us that the most important changes often arrive without spectacle, and that the most meaningful responses are often invisible. The city is not a warning about collapse. It is a reminder about attention. It reminds us that we are always living in a moment that will one day be understood as transitional, even if we do not yet know what it is transitioning into. And if the past is not simply behind us but beside us, echoing in our present experience, then the question is no longer what happened to the city, but what we are doing with the feeling it once had. If we sense that something is changing, if we feel that the future is becoming harder to trust, then the story quietly asks what choices we are making in response. Are we waiting? Are we resisting? Or are we moving? Not necessarily in geography, but in understanding, in priorities, and in the way we imagine what comes next. The city does not answer that question for us. It simply shows us that it exists. When systems begin to strain, societies face a moment that is rarely acknowledged as a choice, but functions as one all the same. They can hold on, reinforce what is weakening, and wait for clarity to return. Or they can loosen their grip and move before the strain becomes rupture. Most histories are written around the first path, because it ends in conflict, collapse, and visible change. The second path is quieter. It does not announce itself. It does not look like an ending. It looks like adjustment. The city becomes a symbol of that second path. It did not wait for destruction to make its decision obvious. It did not demand proof in the form of fire or famine. It responded to the feeling that something was shifting in a way that could not be controlled from within its existing structure. It chose departure over collapse, not because departure was easy, but because collapse would have been irreversible. This kind of leaving does not have to be physical. It can be psychological, cultural, or structural. It can mean letting go of assumptions that no longer fit the world as it is becoming. It can mean releasing identities that were built for conditions that no longer exist. It can mean stepping away from systems that once worked, but now demand more than they return. The city becomes a metaphor for this process. It shows that there is a difference between ending and failing. Failure is something that happens when a system can no longer support itself. Ending is something that happens when people choose to stop supporting a system that no longer serves them. Not every ending is a fall. Some are a release. This perspective shifts the emotional tone of the story. The city is no longer a tragedy. It is a demonstration of agency in the face of uncertainty. It suggests that there is dignity in leaving before harm arrives, and wisdom in recognizing when continuation is more dangerous than change. The story gently moves from history into philosophy here, not to instruct, but to invite reflection. It asks what kinds of systems we live inside now, and how we know when they are becoming fragile. It asks how we recognize the difference between loyalty and inertia, between commitment and fear, between staying because something matters and staying because change feels uncertain. The city does not tell us what to do. It tells us that a choice exists. And with that realization, the story does not close with a conclusion, but with a pause. A pause that leaves space for understanding. Not answers, not certainty, but awareness, which is often enough. There is a natural desire to resolve mysteries, to arrive at a single explanation that gathers all uncertainty into a clean and satisfying conclusion. We are trained to look for causes, to name events, and to close stories with answers. But the past does not always allow itself to be arranged this way. It does not present itself as a finished narrative. It arrives in fragments, in traces, in impressions that survive by chance rather than by design. Archaeology does not recover what happened. It recovers what remained. Stones survive because they are hard. Objects survive because they are buried. Records survive because they were copied. Human intentions, fears, beliefs, and private decisions rarely survive at all. They do not fossilize. They do not leave layers in the ground. They exist in moments and then disappear. The city becomes a reminder of this limitation. It offers evidence of absence, but not evidence of motive. It shows that something changed, but not why it changed. It allows us to observe a result without revealing the process that created it. This is not a failure of research. It is the natural boundary of knowledge. Time does not preserve experience. It preserves residue. The result is that the most important parts of any human story, the reasons people acted, the meanings they assigned to events, and the interpretations that shape their choices, are usually lost first. What remains is the shell, the structure, the shadow of the thing, not the thing itself. This is why no final answer exists for the city. Not because the answer is hidden, but because it was never something that could be stored. It lived inside people who are no longer here. The desire for closure is a modern impulse, shaped by our need for order, efficiency, and certainty. But ancient life was not structured around closure. It was structured around continuity, adaptation, and change. Stories did not end. They transformed. The city's story did not end. It dissolved. The absence of an answer is not an empty space. It is an invitation to approach the past with humility rather than control, to listen rather than solve, to accept that not knowing is not ignorance, but a form of respect for complexity that cannot be reduced. Some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be lived with. This is what allows the city to remain alive in the imagination, rather than sealed into a conclusion. The mystery does not demand resolution. It offers perspective. And if the mystery cannot be closed, then its purpose cannot be explanation alone. Its value must lie in something else, something quieter, something that does not belong to facts or theories, but to the way the story shapes how we see the world, the past, and ourselves. When the need for a final answer is released, something else becomes possible. The mystery no longer feels like a gap that must be filled, but like a space that can be entered. The city's silence stops being a problem to solve and becomes a field of meaning to explore. It invites imagination, not in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of empathy, the effort to feel into a life that cannot be fully known. The absence of explanation allows the city to remain alive in the mind. It does not freeze it into a single story. It leaves it open to many interpretations, many emotional resonances, many quiet reflections. This openness is not a weakness. It is what allows the city to continue speaking long after its physical voice has disappeared. The city becomes a canvas onto which we project our own questions about change, fear, and adaptation. We see in it our own uncertainty about the future, our own desire for stability, and our own hesitation about when to stay and when to leave. The story becomes less about them and more about us, not in a self-centered way, but in a connective one. It reminds us that we are part of a long human pattern, responding to instability with imagination, movement, and meaning. The silence is not empty, it is full. It is full of unspoken decisions, quiet hopes, private fears, and collective choices that never became records. It is full of lives that continued elsewhere, stories that were not written, and paths that were not traced. It is full of the recognition that what matters most is not always what is visible. The city remains silent not because it has nothing to say, but because what it says cannot be spoken directly. It speaks through resonance, through reflection, through the way it changes the listener rather than the listener's knowledge. This is what gives the mystery its lasting power. It does not instruct, it does not conclude, it accompanies. It becomes a gentle reminder that the past is not a place we visit, but a presence that visits us, shaping how we understand time, change, and ourselves. With this perspective, the story no longer needs to hold the listener in suspense. It is ready to let go. The city has offered what it can, not answers, but meaning, and that is enough. The story of the city does not resolve in the way stories are usually told. There is no moment of collapse, no final battle, no dramatic loss that demands grief or outrage. Instead, the city fades from view, not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. It becomes quiet, not because life ended, but because life moved on. This kind of ending feels unfamiliar, because it is not built around conflict or spectacle. It is built around continuity, and continuity rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most lives do not end with announcements. Most cultures do not close with ceremonies. They change shape, merge into other forms, and slowly become something else. Languages shift, traditions blend, and identities evolve until what once felt distinct becomes part of a larger pattern. The city fits into this rhythm. It does not stand as a monument to loss, but as a trace of passage, a place where life once moved through and then carried itself forward. Seen this way, the city is not a victim of history. It is a participant in it. Its people did not vanish. They flowed onward into other places, other communities, and other stories. What remained behind was not failure, but a shell, a quiet outline marking where something meaningful once passed through. The stone stayed, but the meaning moved. This reframes silence not as absence, but as transition. It is not the sound of something breaking, but the sound of something changing direction. The city's stillness becomes gentle rather than empty, and the ending becomes soft rather than final. Most endings do not arrive as endings at all. They arrive as shifts, as dissolutions, as quiet continuations that do not announce themselves. The city invites us to notice this kind of ending, to recognize it not as loss, but as part of how life renews itself through change. And with that recognition, the story prepares to turn one last time, away from the past and toward the listener, not to instruct or warn, but to leave a final reflection that can be carried forward. As the story comes to rest, what remains is not a conclusion, but a presence. The city no longer feels like an object of study or a puzzle to be solved. It feels like a companion that has walked beside us through questions about time, change, and meaning, and now steps back, leaving us with what it has quietly offered. Not information, not instruction, but awareness. An awareness that civilizations are not permanent, not because they are weak, but because they are alive. They move, change, and reshape themselves just as people do. They grow, strain, adapt, and sometimes step away from forms that no longer fit. The city becomes a reminder that change does not always arrive as destruction, and that survival does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like movement, sometimes it looks like release. The silence of the city becomes something the listener carries, rather than something to be explained. It becomes a way of noticing the quiet shifts in our own world, the subtle changes in feeling, in trust, in expectation that tell us when something is beginning to transform. It does not tell us what to do. It teaches us how to listen. The story does not warn or persuade. It simply opens a space where reflection can happen. The city is still speaking. We are just finally quiet enough to hear it. It speaks not through words, but through resonance, through the way it changes how we see continuity and change, presence and absence, endings and beginnings. It reminds us that the most meaningful stories are not always the loudest ones, and that the most important shifts are often the ones that do not demand attention. As the narrative fades, it leaves no command behind. It leaves no instruction, no lesson written in stone. It leaves a feeling instead, a gentle awareness that history is not something that only happens to others, in other times, in distant places. It is something that is always happening, shaped by choices that are often small, quiet, and unseen. The city becomes a lens through which the present looks different, not more frightening, not more certain, just more alive. And in that aliveness, there is a kind of peace. The story does not close. It opens outward into the listener's own reflections, into their own sense of time, change, and continuity. It becomes something that can be carried, not as a memory of facts, but as a way of noticing. There is no next chapter, only the space that remains when a story has finished speaking and the listener has begun to listen.